The night Petra Kwan walked into Harlow's, the kind of restaurant where the bread costs $12 and the lighting makes everyone look like they're being painted, she was 3 weeks into pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had been clumsy about it too, dropped a dessert fork on her first shift, spilled still water on a table of corporate lawyers during her second, and developed a permanent expression of mild apology that her manager, a precise man named Gordon Ashby, described as endearingly incompetent. That was fine. Endearingly incompetent was exactly what she needed to be. The man at table 4 was named Theodore Rains, and he ran the kind of organization that didn't appear in any corporate registry. He arrived at Harlow's every Thursday at 7:15, occupied the same corner banquette upholstered in slate-gray velvet, and ordered the same bottle of Burgundy without looking at the menu. He was 61 years old and had the unhurried posture of a man who had never once been kept waiting for anything. His silver cufflinks caught the candlelight. His handshake, she'd been told, was the last thing 3 men in Vancouver had felt before they disappeared. Petra balanced a tray of amuse-bouches and told herself to breathe. She had been doing this long enough to know that the moments before everything fell apart always felt like ordinary moments. The silverware gleaming, the murmur of conversation, the soft notes of a piano somewhere near the entrance. Tonight the restaurant smelled like truffle oil and money, and somewhere in the kitchen a chef was reducing a sauce that cost more per litre than Petra's rent. Her 9-year-old daughter Maisie was at her sister's place in Burnaby, watching cartoons and eating cereal from the box, and completely unaware that her mother was standing 20 feet from the man whose organization had destroyed their family's fishing business in Prince Rupert, seized their savings through a network of forged contracts, and left Petra's father hospitalized with a stress-related cardiac event that had cost him 2 months of his life and most of what remained of his dignity. Petra lowered the tray. She had 5 more weeks of this, 5 weeks of dropped forks and apologetic smiles and careful, invisible listening. And then the people she was working with, people who existed in the space between law enforcement and something she preferred not to name, would have everything they needed. "These aren't the blinnies I ordered," said Theodore Rains, without looking up. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Rains. I'll get the correct ones right away." He looked at her then, not with interest. With the evaluation one might give a cracked plate, noting the damage, calculating whether it was worth replacement. "How long have you worked here?" "3 weeks, sir." He said nothing for a long moment. The man to his left, a broad-shouldered figure named Doyle, whom Petra had learned never sat with his back to a door, watched her with the flat attention of a surveillance camera. "3 weeks, Miss," Rains repeated, as though the number itself was an inconvenience. "Gordon knows I keep specific preferences about this table." "Yes, sir. He mentioned it. I should have confirmed with the kitchen before." "You should have confirmed with the kitchen before." His voice was mild and even, and somehow colder than anything raised would have been. "Get the correct dish, and perhaps take a moment to review your station's order sheet before you return." "Of course. I apologize." She backed away with her tray and her red face and her carefully manufactured humiliation, and she did not look back until she was through the kitchen doors. Gordon was waiting just inside, his arms crossed, his expression compressed into a single thin line. He complained? "Gently," Petra said. She set down the tray. "I mixed up the order. You mixed up his order." Gordon said this the way people say things they are storing for later use. "Petra, that table is not. I know which table it is. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." She got the correct blinnies. She returned to the table. She refilled water glasses and smiled at the right moments and did not once let her hands shake, though the trembling was there, somewhere beneath the skin, where it had lived for the better part of 18 months. She was back at the service station, entering orders into the system, when she heard it. Not the sound itself first, the feeling that precedes the sound, a vibration in the floor, a pressure change, the way all the small ambient noise of the restaurant contracted a half-second before the entrance doors came off their hinges. They didn't open, they came in. The doors were solid oak, heritage fixtures from Harlow's original 1940s construction. Each one was on a brass pivot hinge rated for 300 kilograms of sustained pressure. The man who walked through them reduced that rating to a suggestion. His name, Petra would learn later, was Gavril. He stood 6'5" in flat-soled boots and was built in a way that seemed to reject the ordinary logic of human proportion. He wore a grey tactical jacket over a frame that looked assembled rather than grown, and the expression on his face was one of absolute concentration, the focused blankness of a tool completing its designated function. He moved like he was made of something denser than other people. The maitre, a polished man named Francois, who had managed the entrance of Harlow's for 11 years with unfailing composure, stepped forward with his hand raised and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you have a—" Gavril walked through him, not past. Through, the way weather moves through a doorway, Francois stumbled backward into the hostess stand and took the reservation book and a vase of white peonies with him as he went down. The dining room went into a different kind of silence. Not silence of consideration or conversation, the silence of a collective nervous system registering something it cannot categorize. Gavril walked toward table 4. One of Raines's security, a man named Walsh who sat 2 tables away and had been nursing the same club soda all evening, stood up. He was professional, quick. His hand was already reaching under his jacket before he'd fully risen from his chair. Gavril caught his wrist on the way past, twisted and deposited Walsh face first into the nearest table. Crystal shattered. A couple near the window stood and pressed themselves against the wall. Someone in the back of the room began to cry in the specific quiet way people cry when they are trying not to be noticed doing it. The second security man, stationed near the bar, made the mistake of announcing himself verbally. "Stop. Right there. Stop." Gavril did not stop. What followed took 4 seconds and ended with the second man on the floor behind the bar with a broken collarbone and an expression of genuine bewilderment that the training he'd relied on for a decade had simply failed to register as applicable. 3 tables away from Theodore Raines, a woman in a blue dress fainted. Her dining companion caught her, mostly. A waiter stood frozen with a wine bottle suspended mid-pour, the Pinot Noir arcing slowly downward onto the white tablecloth in a red expansion that nobody moved to stop. Raines himself had gone very still, his hands flat on the table, his wineglass untouched. Doyle, to his left, had produced a weapon from somewhere and was holding it below the table line. But Petra could see from her position at the service station that he was recalculating whether it would matter. She could also see, in the 40-degree angle of the mirror, mounted above the wine display, that Gavril had a fixed point. He wasn't sweeping the room. He wasn't looking for exits or calculating variables. He was looking at Theodore Raines with the single-minded attention of a compass needle finding north. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot boiled over and set off a brief clatter of sound. Nobody in the dining room moved. The pianist had stopped playing mid-phrase, and the last note hung in the air like something with nowhere to go. Doyle raised his weapon. It was a professional action, controlled and deliberate. He had clearly used it before. He fired once from close range, and the shot hit Gavril in the left shoulder. Gavril paused. He looked at the shoulder, then at Doyle, and then he took the gun away from Doyle with something that looked at speed almost like courtesy, a firm, redirecting motion, and sat Doyle down hard in his chair with a pressure to the collarbone that produced a sound Petra recognized, having heard it once before in a context she did not like to remember, as the sound of something structural giving way. Doyle did not get up. Raines was standing now, pushing back from the table, but the banquette had him bracketed on 2 sides, and the aisle was only wide enough for 1 person, and Gavril was already filling it. Petra was already moving. She didn't decide to move. The decision happened below the level of language, in the part of her that had spent 14 months of her life doing a job whose name she was not allowed to say in her current employment file, and whose skills, and by multiple people, she was no longer permitted to use. Her tray went down. The pins came out of her hair, not for effect, for peripheral vision, to clear the line of sight at her 3 o'clock. She rolled her shoulders, and the person she had been pretending to be for 3 weeks stepped aside like a coat slipping off a hook. "Hey," she said. Gavril didn't look at her. "Hey," she said again, louder, and this time she said it in a register that carried across the room the way very few sounds carry. Not by being loud, but by containing a specific quality of authority that bypasses the conscious mind and goes somewhere older and more instinctive. He looked. She was already closing the distance. Gavril was operating on instruction and chemical certainty, but even he had to recalculate when something small and fast arrived from a direction he wasn't monitoring. He swung toward her. His reach was enormous, the kind of reach that ended conversations before they started, and he used it, one arm sweeping out in a horizontal line that would have caught most people across the chest or face. Petra wasn't most people, and she wasn't there when the arm arrived. She had dropped below it, a movement that was equal parts muscle memory and controlled fall, her right knee touching the floor just long enough to redirect her momentum before she was back up and inside his reach, where the size advantage inverted, and all that bulk became a geometry problem. She drove her elbow up into the nerve cluster beneath his jawline. It wasn't enough to put him down. She hadn't expected it to be. But it bought her a half-second of his attention being elsewhere, while she repositioned behind him, using his own bulk as a fulcrum, her left arm going across his throat in a rear choke that relied not on strength. She didn't have his strength, and never would, but on angle and compression and the simple geometry of blood supply to the brain. Gavril tried to walk backward through her. She let the momentum happen, going with it instead of fighting it, her weight dropping, her grip tightening, her feet finding purchase against the leg of a dining table, which she used to anchor herself against the architectural fact of his weight. He was 6'5" and enormous, and he had absorbed a gunshot without stopping, and none of that mattered because physiology was physiology. He went to his knees, and then, slowly, with the terrible sound of something enormous surrendering to a small and insistent physics, he went forward. The dining room did not react immediately. The reaction happened in stages, the way very large realizations tend to. First silence, then the sound of someone exhaling. Then a small voice near the window said, "Oh my God," in a tone of complete sincerity, and the spell broke, and the room became a mess of motion and noise and overturned chairs as the people who had been frozen began finding their exits. Petra crouched beside Gavril's body, still breathing. She checked, still breathing, and looked up at Theodore Raines. Raines was staring at her. He had the particular expression of a man whose entire architecture of self-understanding has been presented with contradicting evidence. He looked at Gavril, he looked at Petra, he looked at her hair, loose now around her shoulders, and at the service station behind her, where the dessert orders were still loading on the screen. "Who?" he said, and stopped, and tried again. "Who are you? Right now?" Petra said. "I'm the person telling you to get behind the bar." He didn't move. "Mr. Raines." She kept her voice level and her eyes moving, scanning the room because something was wrong. Something in the pattern of what had happened was incomplete. Gavril had come alone. She'd seen that. One person through the door, no flanking entry, no covering the kitchen exit. That was wrong. That was operationally wrong, and she had been doing this long enough to know that when something was operationally wrong, it was because she was missing part of the picture. "Mr. Raines, I need you to move." "Right now. You work here," he said as if this were newly relevant. "I work here 3 days a week. On the other days, I do other things. Please move." She got him behind the bar. He moved like a man in a dream, his Italian wool suit incongruous against the industrial rubber matting and the reach-in coolers full of garnishes, and she crouched beside him and tried to think. Gavril had been a battering ram. Singular, explosive, impossible to ignore, which was exactly what a distraction was supposed to be. She looked at the kitchen door, at the emergency exit to the right of the bar, at the ceiling, where Harlow's had restored the original pressed tin with a series of decorative ventilation fixtures that were, she happened to know from 3 weeks of careful observation, actually functional. "Stay low," she told Rain, he said. His voice was recovering its register, authority reasserting itself, like a reflex. "I can call. Your people are on the floor," Petra said, not unkindly. "Both of them." A silence. "I have other people. How long will they take?" He didn't answer. "Right," said Petra. She moved to the end of the bar and looked over it carefully. The dining room was mostly empty now. The civilians had fled, which was the correct response to the situation, and she was glad they'd managed it. Gavril was still down, but the kitchen door had moved, just slightly, in a way that kitchen doors did not move unless something was coming through them from the other side. She pulled Raines to the far end of the bar and put the wine refrigerator between them and the kitchen door. "The man who just destroyed your security team," she said quietly. "He wasn't here for you." Raines went very still. "What?" "He was bait. Someone needed your security to respond to an active threat, which means your security needed to be occupied, which means the thing they wanted to keep your security from preventing is happening somewhere else. Tonight. Right now." She glanced at the kitchen door again. "Or it's already in the building. You're saying someone used him as a distraction?" "Yes. Then who are they actually after?" Petra looked at him. Raines processed this. She watched it happen, the way a man who had spent 30 years being the most dangerous thing in any room he occupied had to reconstruct his understanding of his own position. "You," he said. "Someone burned my cover, which means someone knew I was here, which means either the organization I work with has a problem or I do." She paused. "Or you do, Mr. Raines. Is there anyone you've spoken to about this restaurant? About Thursdays? About your routine?" He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The kitchen door opened. 2 of them, tactical gear, suppressed weapons, the practiced movement of people who had done it in actual buildings and training facilities. They moved in pairs, covering angles, one high and one low, the kind of entry technique that was expensive in both time and instruction to learn properly. Professional. Well-funded. Not local. Petra pulled Raines flat against the floor, behind the wine refrigerator as the first suppressed round hit the mirrored display behind the bar and turned it into a constellation of falling glass. She moved without pausing, pulling a bottle from the rack above her, not as a weapon, not yet, but as a way of knowing what she had and what its weight was. And she thought about the kitchen. The kitchen was where she needed to be. Not here, bracketed behind a bar with two professionals cutting angles on her position and the noise of glass settling like a slow rainfall around them. "When I move," she said to Rains, "you move. You follow me, and you do not stop. If you stop, I cannot help you. I weigh 60 kilograms more than you." "I know," she said. "I'll manage." "Ready?" She didn't wait for an answer. She cracked the door at the end of the bar, a service access she'd memorized on day 4, and pushed Rains through it ahead of her and went through herself on the ground, rolling, the suppressed rounds hitting the floor where she'd been with. Sounds like somebody dropping a stapler. Unremarkable except for what they meant. The kitchen was bright and loud and hot, and it was the best place she'd been all evening. She knew this kitchen, not from cooking. Her culinary skills were honest and limited, but from 2:15 in the morning on a Wednesday in week 2, when she had told Gordon she needed to recheck the close and instead walked every inch of the space with the lights up and a notepad she left in her locker afterward. Every door, every surface, every piece of equipment that was too heavy to move and too hot to approach without purpose. She knew where the walk-in was. She knew which gas valves were manual. She knew that the industrial oven on the left had a faulty thermostat that Gordon had been trying to get serviced for a month, which meant its internal temperature ran 20 degrees hotter than its display indicated. She knew, more to the point, where the second exit was. "The back corridor," she said to Rains, moving him toward the far wall. 60 feet. Loading access. There's a freight elevator that opens to the parking structure on level 2. You memorized our emergency egress." "I memorized everything," she said. "That's the job." One of the tactical operators came through the kitchen door and immediately took the pot of consommé that Petra had pulled from the nearest burner across the chest and face. It was not a clean or pleasant thing to do, and she did it anyway, and in the moment he spent dealing with the surprise and the heat, she crossed the distance between them and put him down with a precision strike to the throat that left him breathing, but not immediately mobile. The second operator was smarter and hung back and kept his angle, which meant Petra couldn't advance on him without taking a round she wasn't interested in taking. She pulled Rains into the narrow space between the prep tables, crouching low, moving fast. "Do you want to know the part I genuinely didn't expect?" she said, keeping her voice conversational while her eyes tracked the shadow at the kitchen door. Rains's breathing was audible and not fully controlled. "This seems like an odd time. It keeps me calm," she said. "What I didn't expect was that it would be your connection. You have a new associate. Someone you brought in 3 months ago, London-based, who you've been developing a distribution channel with. Someone who had access to your schedule and your preferences and the specific location of your weekly dinner." A long pause. "Jeffrey," Rains said, very quietly. "I don't know his name. I know he exists because someone burned me, and the only people who knew my cover were my organization and whoever you talk to." "So?" She tracked the shadow. It had stopped moving. That was bad. Stopped movement in tactical situations meant the person had found a better angle and was waiting to use it. "Mr. Rains," Petra said quietly, "I have a daughter. She's 9. She eats cereal out of the box, and she's currently watching cartoons at my sister's place in Burnaby, and she is the person I came home for every single time I did this job. And I am telling you that so you understand that I am highly motivated to resolve this evening in a way that results in me going home." "I understand," Rains said. "I also want you to understand that the reason I haven't left you here, and I could have left you, this room has 4 exits, and I know all of them, is not because I need you. It's because there are 2 kitchen staff hiding in the walk-in who didn't get out in time, and if I leave, whoever is behind that door will eventually find them. So we're going to resolve this together, and then we are going to have a different conversation about what happens next." He looked at her in the near dark of the space between the prep tables, with the fluorescent kitchen lights beyond and the sound of something dripping from an overturned saucepot and sirens beginning somewhere outside, distant and getting closer. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I testify," she said, "and so does anyone else who was in this restaurant tonight. The kind where the past 18 months of documentation sees daylight, the kind where Prince Rupert gets its answer." Rains was quiet. "My father," Petra said, and her voice did something she hadn't given it permission to do. A slight tightening at the bottom of the word, the place where the anger and the grief lived together without enough space, spent 12 years building something in that harbor. And your organization took it apart in 8 months, using contracts that were engineered to be unreadable, and a network that your people specifically designed to leave no trace. I have the trace. I've had it for 6 months. What I didn't have was corroborating testimony." Another pause. "So why are you keeping me alive?" Rains asked. "Because dead defendants don't testify against their former associates. And because those kitchen staff deserve to go home, and one of them is 19 years old, and I have categorically decided that no 19-year-old dies on a Thursday because of administrative choices I could have made differently. She shifted, watching the door, and because my daughter would like to have a mother who comes home. She could see in the particular quality of his stillness that something had shifted. Not remorse. She had no illusions about what Theodore Raines was or what remorse cost people like him, but the specific calculation of a man who had spent 30 years understanding leverage. "If I testify," he said, "you'll face charges." "Yes, then, you'll face them alive," Petra said, "and with a lawyer, which is more than 3 people in Vancouver got." She heard, from the direction of the kitchen door, the precise sound of a radio earpiece clicking. The 2-click pattern that meant regroup, that meant something in the situation had changed and the operator was adjusting. She knew that pattern. She had used that pattern, which meant whoever was running this operation outside the building now knew the police were arriving. The shadow at the kitchen door moved, back toward the dining room. "They're pulling out," she said. Professional response to the sirens. "They'll be gone in 90 seconds. She waited, counted. At 80, she moved to the kitchen door and looked through the service window at a dining room that was empty of everything except overturned furniture. 2 of Raines's people on the floor who were breathing. She confirmed this, and Gavril, who was also breathing and had not moved. The entrance doors, what remained of them, showed only the street and the first distant blue and red of the police response. She went back to the walk-in and knocked twice. "You can come out. Police are arriving. Stay in the kitchen until they reach you." 2 voices responded, young, frightened, functional. She was glad. She returned to the bar and found the apron she'd dropped behind it and picked it up and held it for a moment, looking at it. The fabric was printed with Harlow's crest in burgundy thread. Her name tag was still pinned to the left side. Petra K., it said, staff member. Raines stood nearby, watching her with an expression she'd seen before on people who had just experienced a significant recalibration. He was putting himself back together. It would take a while. It always did. "What happens now?" he asked. "Police come in, you tell them a man broke down your door and attacked your security. Which is true. You tell them you were protected by a member of staff who left before you could get her full name, because it was chaotic. Which is also true to other men, the ones in the kitchen. One of them is incapacitated. The other left. The responding officers will find what they find." Petra pinned the name tag from her apron onto the bar counter, smoothed side down. "The conversation we need to have doesn't happen tonight. It happens through a specific channel and a specific intermediary who will contact you in the next 72 hours. And, if I don't respond," she looked at him evenly, "then the documentation I've spent 18 months assembling goes to a journalist in Ottawa who has been wanting a story like this since 2019 and has the patience and the sources to run it correctly. And you have no control over the narrative, no opportunity to cooperate, and no leverage." She paused. "Your choice." Raines was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sirens were very close now. The first lights were washing the destroyed entrance in alternating blue and red. "Your father," he said finally, "the harbour. Prince Rupert. Yes, I didn't know his name. He knows yours," Petra said. "He's known it for a long time." She moved toward the service corridor at the back of the kitchen. The freight elevator was where she remembered it. The parking structure below would have an exit to the alley on the north side, and from the alley it was 4 blocks to the SkyTrain, and from the SkyTrain it was 40 minutes to Burnaby. And from Burnaby it was approximately 90 seconds from her sister's door to Maisie's arms. Assuming Maisie was still awake, which she probably was because Maisie had inherited her mother's relationship with sleep schedules. "Wait," Raines said. She stopped. "You said you've been here 3 weeks. He looked at her the way people looked at optical illusions when they finally understood the image. Not with pleasure exactly, but with the specific relief of resolution. "Who are you, before tonight?" "Someone who needed to know what you knew," she said, "and someone who, as of tonight, has what she came for." She put her hand on the corridor door. "Get behind the bar, Mr. Raines. Hands visible. They'll treat you correctly, and if I ever see you again," she almost smiled. "You won't," she said. "But if you ever find yourself wondering whether what you do affects people you never meet, families in places you've never been, kids growing up with less than they should have had, I'd like you to remember tonight. I'd like you to remember that the person who stood between you and something very bad was someone with a daughter in Burnaby and a father in a hospital in Prince Rupert who still hasn't fully recovered." She opened the door. "Live differently," she said. "Or at least try." The door swung shut behind her, and the corridor was cool and industrial and very quiet, and Petra walked through it without looking back. Later, much later, after the statements and the scene documentation, and the long, careful work of making sure the kitchen staff had support and that Gavril had been taken in and processed, and that the tactical operators who'd been found had no clean act from the jurisdiction. The lead detective on the file, a careful woman named Sergeant Bryce, who had worked major crimes in Vancouver for 9 years, would review the footage from Harlow's remaining functional camera and find it cut out at the precise moment of interest. She would ask Theodore Raines 3 times about the woman. 3 times he would tell her he hadn't gotten a clear look, that everything had happened very fast, that he owed her his life and didn't know her name. The 4th time, Sergeant Bryce would lay a staff photo from Harlow's HR file on the table between them. A woman in a black uniform, blonde hair pinned back, looking slightly to the left of the camera with an expression of mild distraction. Raines would look at it for a long time. "I genuinely couldn't tell you," he would say, and Sergeant Bryce End would note in the careful margin of her case notes that she believed him and wasn't sure why, and that somehow that made it worse. The name tag was never formally entered into evidence. It was catalogued, filed, and eventually transferred to a storage facility in Surrey, where it lived in an archival box alongside a handwritten table map and 2 weeks of dessert orders that no one would ever look at again. Petra Kay, staff member, 3 weeks of service. 2 days later, a 9-year-old girl in Burnaby woke up to find her mother in the kitchen making actual breakfast for once. Not cereal, but eggs with cheese and toast with the good jam. And she ate it without asking questions, because she had her mother's instincts. And those instincts told her that some mornings you just accepted the eggs and were grateful. Outside, Vancouver moved through an ordinary grey morning. Rain on the windows, traffic on the Lug Heed. The whole enormous ordinary fact of a city that didn't know what had happened in a restaurant in the West End the night before, and wouldn't, because the people who knew were either lawyers, or in custody, or very quietly on their way to a conversation with an intermediary in a place that didn't require names. And somewhere in Prince Rupert, a man named Edwin Kwan sat up in his kitchen chair at 7 in the morning, as he had every morning for 18 months, and did not know that the answer he had been waiting for was finally, quietly, on its way home.